for coming. And we've got, like I said, we've got some folks on tonight remotely that are watching. I'm going to introduce Mr. Barnes, Carl Barnes, for the National Weather Service. He's going to do his presentation, and at that point, what we'll do is we'll open the floor for any questions that you may have. Because here in the room with us, I have Miss Stacy Miles back here in the back. She is the emergency manager for Onslow County. She works with Norm Bryson with the Emergency Services Division of the county. I have Amanda and James from Marine Corps Family Team Building Program. So if anybody's here from MARSOC or got questions about something that may happen on board the installation, between her and the gentleman sitting back here in the corner trying to hide from everybody, Mr. Mike Impastato. He is the Camp Lejeune installation emergency manager. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Barnes, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to double check. So we do have a few people who are joining us virtually too, and it looks like audio is working good. So I think we're good to go ahead and get started. I am Carl Barnes. I'm from the National Weather Service up in Morehead City. We cover most of Eastern North Carolina. Below us, we have a few other offices too that we'll talk about here in a couple slides, but appreciate everyone coming out. I'd like to start off, it's a forum, it's not a lecture, so I want to keep it very involved, have a lot of discussion, really encourage questions, but I'll start out with my own question of, does anyone want to share what their worst hurricane they've been through is? In their opinion, what was the worst one they've been through? Florence? Yep. That's a popular one. Hazel, yeah, that's a good, that's 54, right? 54, I think. Yep. So that was probably, for Eastern North Carolina, that was probably the worst storm in the last maybe 100 years or so, in some perspectives.
I would say Florence was pretty bad, but we got out of Dodge, but Bertha. Because my daughter was born during.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great point of, like, you know, these hurricanes are, yeah, they're storms, they're, it's physics and everything that are driving these storms, but there's a personal story to all these storms. And so a big part of what we want to do is make sure that your personal story from these storms isn't a bad one. So that's, that's why we really preach preparedness and all that, and not just waiting until the storm's arriving to prepare, but doing it well beforehand. So yeah, I mean, I think Florence, for a lot of people who live here now, Florence was a big one. It was only, I mean, it's actually hard to believe it was almost 4 years ago now, but it felt like it lasted forever. I mean, it was, at our office, we have a metal roof, and so the rain beating on the roof, it was just 72 straight hours of pouring rain, blowing sideways, wind damage and all that. We don't have to relive it, but I mean, that was, I think for around here, it's, we see where if you go years without having a storm, people tend to kind of let their guard down or forget how bad they can be. But Florence is still such a recent memory that, it still gets a lot of people's attention when you say it. And I think a lot of people have, in some ways almost PTSD from Florence of just how, I mean, there's a lot of people, like, you can still, in Morehead City, you can drive around and still see damage from Florence. And there's a lot of areas where there's still damage. So, all right, yeah, thanks for sharing that. So we can go ahead and jump in. I just want to run through, some preparedness information, a little bit of information on, what we would expect from impacts of storms, what the Weather Service does. But again, tons of time at the end for discussion, question, answer, that kind of thing. That's really what this is all about. There we go. Okay. So like I said, our office covers most of Eastern North Carolina. We're here in Morehead City, but we go all the way up to the Albemarle Sound, almost all the way inland to Interstate 95. And then we're actually on the very southern periphery of our area right here. You go down Pender County, and south of there is going to fall under the office in Wilmington's jurisdiction. But most of Eastern North Carolina is us, including a ton of coastline, a lot of low-lying areas in there too, rivers, sounds, all that. So at our office, we have, this is a picture of the operations floor. This is actually during Florence. So we don't normally have this many people on shift, but we do really surge staffing when we have impactful weather. This was during a shift briefing. So you have people who are finishing a 12-hour shift, briefing people who are just coming into the shift. So you can kind of, if you look at some people, there's some people look exhausted and some people look a little more ready to go. So obviously a high impact storm for us, but 24/7, even when the weather's quiet, we're there, we're working, we're watching radar. In the summertime, we have thunderstorms almost every afternoon. So we're watching that, severe thunderstorm warnings, tornado warnings, that kind of thing. It's, never a dull moment. Even when the weather's quiet, it seems like we go into a drought, and then we have to provide forecasts to farmers of when, the rain might return. And there's just always something, fire, weather concerns, that kind of thing. So 24/7, we're there. We got about 22 to 25 people, depending on our staffing at the time. About 15 of those are meteorologists, and the rest are support staff. Most of our information, the best way to get it is going to be through our website, weather.gov/moreheadcity. It's really the central repository. You can get forecasts. You can get, when we have impactful storms that we're expecting, you can get these more storm-based impact briefings from our webpage. If you just go to this on our homepage, and we have an icon that says latest storm briefing. We'll also link it to the top whenever we're expecting that. So that weather.gov/moreheadcity is a great website to remember, especially if we're looking at potential for an impactful storm. You can go there and get the information straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. We're also really big on social media. I don't know that social media is big on us. Facebook algorithms can tend to make our posts show up out of order, which isn't very useful when you're trying to put timely information out for the weather. So I don't know that this is the best outlet for sharing weather information. Twitter keeps things in order, but I don't have a Twitter. I don't know how many people do, but Facebook, we do put a lot of really good information up there. So I would definitely, if you have an account, I'd give us a follow, Facebook, Twitter, and we're also on YouTube. So we'll put briefings and stuff up on YouTube when we're expecting impactful weather. So then shifting now, let's focus on hurricanes. So we are early in the season still. We did have the first storm, I think it was Alex, that passed well off the coast, came across Florida before it developed into Alex, came across Florida and then developed into Tropical Storm Alex, passed out, went right over Bermuda. But we're still in the early part of the season here in June, where we don't usually see much activity. We can get some storms. We have seen in the past that even as early as like late May, early June, we'll get some weaker storms that form off the coast and maybe bring us some rainfall and all that. But it's really once we start getting into the later part of July through August, September, and into October, that's when we see a lot of activity in the tropics. But the hurricane season is the hurricane season for a reason. All the way from June 1st through the end of November is when we see the tropics the most active. And here's just a few of our most recent storms. So you can see Dorian, Florence, Isaias, we're right there around the busier time of the season. But looking back over the last 10 years or so, there's really a pretty wide spectrum of when these storms that impact us can form. So the full season is the full season for a reason. So we encourage preparedness now. Don't wait till there's actually a storm bearing down on us. Tropical cyclone frequency. This is one of our office's claim to fame. We are actually, Eastern North Carolina is the most frequently impacted area for hurricanes in the continental United States. So that's even more often than Miami and the Keys. So we, on average, storm passes within, I believe it's 50 miles of the Outer Banks, about a hurricane, about once every 5 years. But we get direct impacts from a hurricane way more often than that. So that's just the center of the storm. But this is still a good graphic to represent, like, we are the most frequently impacted by these tropical systems in the US. And it's not hard to see why. I mean, we stick way out here. So these storms that move over through the Caribbean or even through the Gulf, and then what we call recurve, they'll move back up the East Coast. We just stick out, so it's hard to miss us. So if you're interested in additional hurricane preparedness information, I do want to go ahead and right up front plug it, weather.gov/moreheadcity/hurricane-prep. All the information we talk about today, plus a lot more, is going to be available on that webpage if you want to go find more information for yourself. We're just going to really just skim the surface of some of this information. So at weather.gov/moreheadcity/hurricane-prep. All right, so here in Eastern North Carolina, we're generally low. We do have some really large rivers, but I mean, you can see we're not hilly. It's not always obvious what areas flood and won't flood. So I also want to make a plug for this is actually done by the state of North Carolina. So at the Weather Service, we fall under the federal jurisdiction, but the state of North Carolina has this flood risk information system. This is a really great resource. I came here from the Charleston, South Carolina office. There was nothing like this in South Carolina. So this is a great resource. If you just Google NC flood maps, you'll find this, and it's a really good way to look up, you know, maybe not just your property, but if you do evacuate, just check along the roads on your way back, or, you know, getting out of your neighborhood, just look at the area around where you would be driving and see maybe your house isn't so vulnerable to flooding, but I mean, we've seen that, you know, neighborhoods can get cut off even though the houses are fine. And then for Florence, I know our office didn't flood, but we couldn't go anywhere for almost 2.5 days after the rain stopped because we were flooded in every direction. So we were fine, we were safe, but we couldn't get resources if we needed them. So that, again, just Google NC flood maps. It'll be the first thing that pops up. Really good resource. Sorry. All right, so a few things that you do want to make sure that you have a disaster supply kit. So at least 3 days is what they say, but really more like 7. You know, kind of understand your area, especially if you live on topsoil or maybe you live in one of the lower lying areas. Again, you might get cut off. Florence washed out roadways, so there were areas that weren't accessible, and that was, you know, we just saw that 4 years ago. So we know, you know, we know that getting these resources after a storm can be really challenging, and you know, the emergency managers and the first responders, they have a huge laundry list of stuff to do after a storm. So if you can be self-sufficient for as long as possible, that's going to be extremely beneficial to them in their operations. So at least 3 days, but really we recommend 7. You want to think about, all right, if I don't have electricity, so I mean, maybe you have a generator. Really want to encourage you, if you do have a generator, make sure you're always running it outside, not in your garage, certainly not inside. Carbon monoxide poisoning after a storm is actually a really big killer. In some cases, more people die from carbon monoxide after the storm than die from the direct effects from the storm. So make sure you run that generator outside, but make sure you have enough food and water, non-perishable food in case you don't have electricity. Medicine and prescriptions, you're not going to be able to get that for probably several days after a storm at least. So make sure you have a good stock of that. Radio with batteries, that's could be the best way to get emergency information. After Florence, I know up where we were, all of the cell towers were down. So, and we didn't have internet at our office. So it really was just any way we could. We had ham radios that we were using, and then just FM radio, we were getting some information from that too. So radio with batteries, keep your gas tank full. This is really any time during hurricane season, because as soon as a storm starts to look like it could bear down on us, and again, this is something we saw before Florence, but I mean, the gas stations can get extremely busy and even run out of gas. We've seen that even when there's not a national shortage, we've seen that. And so it's always a good idea. I usually try to keep it at least half full during hurricane season. And then keep cash on hand. It's another thing. After Florence, we saw this. When the internet went down, stores couldn't take credit cards anymore. So some grocery stores were able to reopen, but they only took cash. So just think about, you know, put yourself in that position of no power, probably not going to be able to get resources, pharmacy's not going to be open. So think about what you might need in your disaster kit. And then develop an evacuation plan. If you are going to leave, how are you going to leave? Do you know your zone? North Carolina has evacuation zones. If you, again, just Google North Carolina, know your zone, and it'll pop right up. You'll be able to look up your zone. But what's your plan? Do you have what you need for the car ride? Do you know where you're going? Do you know how to get there? It's just a good idea to look at that stuff now, because when we do have a storm that's maybe bearing down on us, the stress can really, I mean, we've seen where people's level of being able to retain information decreases significantly once there's outside stressors. So, you know, don't wait until there's actually a named storm or something like that. Just think about it now and make sure everyone in your family is on the same page. And don't forget about your pets, please. All right, so let's get into some of the fun meteorology side of things. Anyone heard of spaghetti models? You know what they look like? You got a bunch of spaghetti noodles going all over the map. We've seen some storms where it's a huge spread of the spaghetti. Sometimes it's all in the same place and maybe it looks a little bit better behaved. I mean, here's a great example of it. I think this was from Florence, but Florence was way out east of the Caribbean, kind of out in the central North Atlantic. And we had this spaghetti model. So, or we had this what we call like the spaghetti plot. So we could see most models were kind of bringing it generally toward us, but I don't know, maybe it was going to go up and miss the Outer Banks, or maybe it was going to go down to Florida. These, you see these on the news a lot. I really want to caution people. All of these noodles of spaghetti are not built equally. Some of those models are really good and some of them aren't. And some of them are good in some situations and bad in other situations. And the National Hurricane Center really understands what models are good and what aren't. And just looking at this, you can't tell. I can't tell just looking at this. That's really a level of expertise that takes years of training to understand. So really want to encourage you. You'll see it on the news, you'll see it different places, but really this is what you want to be looking at. The cone of uncertainty is a great graphic to look at. Look at the official information coming out of the National Hurricane Center, because what they're able to do is throw out those bad models and then look at the good models and weigh those with their, I mean, a lot of people down there have 20 or 30 years of expertise. So really want to encourage you not to get too caught up in the spaghetti models, because all of those models are not built equally. And while we're talking about the National Hurricane Center, I want to make a plug for, this is really a huge success of science, what the National Hurricane Center has been able to do over the last 50 years to 60 years. So in 1960 to 1969, this top line, don't worry too much about the graph, but the point of this is at 72 hours, so 3 days out, the average error of the forecast in the 60s was about 400 miles. 400 miles is here to Jacksonville, Florida. That was the average error. That wasn't even like the biggest error that they had. That was their average error. So really when a hurricane was coming, they couldn't do much better than it might hit somewhere on the East Coast, or it might just curve back out to the ocean. They didn't really know. But each decade it's gotten progressively better. So as the lines further down the graph are lower error. So now we're seeing just in the last 2 years, and then even really going back over the last 12 years or so, back to 2010, the mean errors 3 days out are only about 50 miles. Way better. I mean, if you're trying to plan, that 400 miles just isn't helping you. 50 miles, you're getting a pretty good idea. So again, I want to stress, like, the National Hurricane Center has done incredible work to get their forecast much, much better over the last 50 or 60 years. Huge success of science. And here's another way to visualize that. So now we're talking about Floyd. So this is just 23 years ago. Anyone here for Floyd? Anyone remember Floyd? Okay, so it came, made landfall near Wilmington, brought some wind impacts, but really the big thing was the rainfall from the storm. We got really excessive rainfall. It was focused a little further inland, so there was a lot more like river flooding further inland, but still almost Florence-like, and just some areas were completely underwater. Whole towns were flooded. But so looking at 1999, the bigger circle here was the average error of the forecast for 3 days in 1999. So again, you got a storm sitting out here, and kind of the best the Hurricane Center could do is say it's probably going to be somewhere between southern Georgia and maybe the Delmarva Peninsula for where the center of the storm is going to go. And then 2019, when we had Florence, I mean, who here didn't know Florence was coming? It was a storm that was extremely well forecast by the Hurricane Center. Maybe we couldn't tell you exact details, but if you didn't know it was coming, you were maybe living under a rock, because we had a good idea several days ahead. Evacuation orders were put in, all that. And that's because these better forecasts give emergency managers and the people who need to make the decisions more confidence in the decision that they're making. They don't want to evacuate if you don't have to, because we've seen storms 20, 25 years ago. I can't remember the name of the storm off the top of my head, but it made landfall in Louisiana, and they evacuated Houston because there was so much uncertainty in the forecast. And it ended up 7 or 8 people died during the evacuation just on the road. The roads got clogged up, people ran out of gas, didn't have food and all that. And then where the storm actually made landfall, I think there were only 1 or 2 fatalities. So they really, really don't want to evacuate unnecessarily, because there is a huge risk in evacuating on top of the economic impact and all that. And then one more thing to note. So again, this graph, the further to the top and right you go, the less accurate the forecast. The further to the bottom and left you go, the more accurate. So the NHC here, this black dot, is the National Hurricane Center forecast. Most important takeaway from this is they're the best forecast. These other dots are models. So you might have heard of the European model, the American model. The red dot's the European, the blue is the American. Those are actually both very close in skill. but the NHC forecast, the Hurricane Center forecast, is better than all those. So one more plug, really, the Hurricane Center makes extremely good forecasts. They're not always going to nail it, but they really are the best resource for this. And you can get a lot of their information at hurricanes.gov. It's very easy to remember. Hurricanes.gov, that'll take you right to the Hurricane Center webpage. And this is probably the most common graphic that you'll see on the news or anything like that. If they're showing potential track of a storm, this cone graphic. Just want to make sure to stress this cone graphic is showing you the most likely track of the center of the storm. So it's really important to understand impacts can be felt well outside of that cone, but that's the most likely track of the center of the storm. So, I mean, we saw in Florence, it made landfall down by Wilmington, but it brought significant storm surge to New Bern and Washington, North Carolina, and areas up well further north. So, you know, don't focus too much on the cone, but in terms of deciding whether or not you have any potential impacts from the storm, but just use the cone to get a general feel for where the storm might go. And then they also do on that hurricanes.gov webpage for these storms, they also produce other really useful graphics like the probability that you will see tropical storm or hurricane force winds, potential time of arrival of those winds. So that can be very important for planning. If you want to put up storm shutters or board up your windows or something like that, so you want to make sure that you're doing that before the winds arrive. So again, that hurricanes.gov, you know, they have a lot of different ways that they break these threats down. So it's a really good resource. And they do earliest possible time of arrival as well as most likely time of arrival. So let's talk about the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. We hear a lot of people, I'm not gonna ask anyone to raise hands for this, because we hear a lot of people who say, I'm not evacuating unless it's a category 3, or unless it's a 2 or a 4. Or, I mean, if you're on the Outer Banks, they might say, I'm not gonna go unless it's a 5. Really want to discourage you from taking that approach, because this hurricane wind scale, the Saffir-Simpson scale, category 1, 2, 3, whatever, it gets a lot of attention, rightfully so. It is representative of the winds of a storm, but it's representative only of the winds of a storm. Were the winds the biggest deal in Florence? No. So the Florence was a category 1, but I think, you know, impact-wise, I don't think anyone would say, oh, it was just category 1 impacts. So there's a lot more to this story. Hurricane Sandy, when it made landfall up in the Northeast, it wasn't technically a hurricane anymore, but it was about the equivalent of a low-end category 1 storm. They saw it, I think they saw 12 to, in some locations, maybe 15 feet of storm surge from that storm. So that, again, just a category 1 is just, you know, don't focus on the category. It's not always a good representation of all of the impacts of the storm. It's just wind. So it's about all of the impacts. From 2010 to 2019, category, again, I say this because we hear it a lot, just category 1 storms. So if you ever hear anyone say, oh, it's just a category 1, you can be, nope, it's a category 1. It's not just a category 1. But we had, over those 10 years, there was 175 direct deaths and over $100 billion of damage from just category 1 storms. So don't focus exclusively on the category, really try to understand all of the impacts. And from a fatality standpoint, it's water that kills. So we identify these storms by their category, but we've seen it's water that kills. Over the last 50 or so years, the vast majority of hurricane deaths were from storm surge. Or I shouldn't say that was the greatest killer, not the majority, but that was the greatest killer of people with storm surge, followed second by rain. It's almost 3/4 of the fatality are just water related, not even covered by the wind scale number. So really good thing to keep in mind. And you can see, I mean, even drilling down further, surf, marine incidents, all that, it's really wind and tornado damage only accounts for about 10% of the fatalities from hurricanes for the last 50 years. But the water doesn't always get the attention. The hurricane category gets the attention, and we want to change that. And then this is another, so this is just over the last 4 years. We've actually gotten a lot better at forecasting storm surge. And the emergency managers that we work with have gotten a lot better at targeted evacuations and how to message that. And so we've actually seen a huge change in the last 4 years, and it's now the freshwater rainfall flooding. It's causing the majority of deaths, and storm surge fatalities are way down. And this includes storms like Michael, which essentially wiped Mexico Beach off the map, covered all of Mexico Beach in 10+ feet of water. There were no storm surge fatalities in that storm. That's incredible to think about because the forecast was very good and the evacuations were punctual and very targeted. And there's a lot of success stories. Harvey near Corpus Christi, same thing. So now we're actually shifting our focus to this inland freshwater flooding, rainfall, river flooding, because that's where we're starting to see the most fatalities. So flash flooding, again, I don't want to harp on Florence too much, but it's just such a historic storm. It's hard not to talk about it. This area saw almost 3 feet of rain in about the course of 3 days. I mean, that's incredible. That's a lot of places that I think people didn't ever expect to flood were underwater. We saw up in Jones County, we saw some essentially whole towns. Pollocksville in Jones County was essentially the whole town was underwater. I think every single business there had some damage. Trenton, again in Jones County, lots of areas that we saw really significant flooding from the storm. So the rainfall initially floods, flash flooding is the biggest threat. The rapid rise of water. This is something where we will issue flash flood warnings. Those should get, assuming we still have communications and everything, those should get pushed out to your phone when they're issued. Maybe you've gotten a flash flood warning before, maybe you did if you stayed for Florence, but that's something where when you get that, that's us telling you, all right, we've seen the amount of water that we expect to start quickly flooding areas that are normally dry. That might be roadways. We don't want you to get washed off the road in your car. That could be your house if you're in a low-lying area. We want you to get that heads up so that you can take action immediately. We don't want you to be running from the water as it's rising. We want you to get prepared immediately. So if you live on a 2-story house, maybe get up to the 2nd floor of your house. In Harvey and Houston, they saw that people got up into their attic, the water continued to rise, and they didn't have a way out. So if you think about your attic, the only way out is usually the door in the bottom of your attic. When that water starts coming up, you can't go down into the water. So then people were having to try to figure out how to punch holes through their roof. Not an easy thing to do if you don't have tools. So we really want to encourage you, don't go into your attic. If you've reached, if you're getting to the point where you're no longer safe in your house, try to call 911 or somehow reach emergency personnel. They might have a way to rescue you, but don't go into your attic, because we saw a lot of people who essentially ended up with no options when they tried to get higher into their attic. Go under your roof. It might be hurricane winds, but it's going to be the lesser of two evils. Do not go into your attic. And then river flooding. So the flash flooding happens usually immediately while the rain's falling. All that water has to go somewhere, flows into our rivers, and then we have this much longer term river flooding. This can last, for Florence, major flooding lasted for 3 to 4 weeks after the storm, and then still at least minor flooding lasted for months after the storm. We're so flat, that water travels so slowly that it takes a long time for the water to recede. Some things to keep in mind, this can flood houses in the floodplain, this can flood roadways, but if you do evacuate, or if you're on the fence about evacuating, try to understand what kind of vulnerabilities there are along that road that you're evacuating. So after Florence, people evacuating, I think Interstate 40 was definitely closed for a while. I think 421 goes west out of Wilmington. I believe that was even damaged to the point where they had to repair it before they could reopen that road. From Morehead City, 70 was closed in Kinston for an extended period of time. So try to understand not just where you are, but your evacuation routes, the area around your community. And one more plug, we've also gotten a lot better at forecasting rainfall. So this was the forecast leading up to Hurricane Florence here on the left, with the area across much of southeast North Carolina. We're looking at, I know it's a little hard to see that graphic, but looking at generally 20 to 30 inches was the forecast, and that ended up working out pretty well. If you look at this, there were a few areas that were even a little bit over that 30 inches, which is really incredible. But again, try to understand all the impacts, understand the forecast, don't just focus on that category. Now we'll talk about storm surge. So we do have a lot of low-lying areas around here. I love living on the coast. I don't think I could ever move away from the coast, but storm surge is unfortunately a fact of life if you're going to live near the coast. This was, again, looking at Florence storm surge. We saw, in this area, we saw up to 5 to 8 feet. That's not saying there was 5 to 8 feet everywhere, but especially along the beaches, we saw the dunes for North Topsail were basically eliminated. A lot of like parking lots and properties were covered with sand and water. We have seen these surge amounts. Storm surge is challenging to forecast. We're getting better, but timing is difficult to pin down. We also have tides here, so it makes a difference if it hits at high tide or low tide. But there are ways where you can try to understand your vulnerability to storm surge leading up to the storm. So this is hurricanes.gov/national surge is a great way. Basically shows you a worst case scenario for different wind, because it's wind that drives the surge. So different wind speeds for storms. So this one would be like the wind speed equivalent to a Category 2 hurricane. This is a worst case scenario for the area we're in now. So you can see a lot of, especially the backside of Topsail, there's a lot of low-lying areas, and then areas kind of adjacent to Stump Sound and up some of the creeks. So you can see, I mean, we can have surge pushing well inland. We are fortunate in this part of Onslow County, we have some pretty decent bluffs near waterways. So like actually within the town of Holly Ridge is a little bit lower vulnerability. It's a little higher elevation, but especially if you live near the water, you want to try to understand your storm surge vulnerability, not just for your property, but maybe getting in and out of your neighborhood and stuff like that. And this is something new that we're adding this year. So this is an experimental peak surge forecast. Unfortunately, we can't, when we're doing our surge forecast, we can't message, because surge is so locally variable, we can't message the surge at every specific location. But we do try to give a general surge amount for stretches of the coast. And then we'll work with emergency managers to help them understand where those vulnerabilities are going to be the greatest so they can follow evacuation orders. So that's my best piece of advice for surge. You know, try to understand your vulnerability and certainly look at the forecast and try to understand how severe it might be. But ultimately, if you get put under an evacuation order, that's for a reason. Even if your house isn't going to flood, if your community floods. I got a story when I was working in South Carolina after Hurricane Matthew in 2016. We went out to this little stretch of coastline where there were just a few houses. Can't remember the name of the town right now, but it was very near Fripp Island, South Carolina. And the community was empty except for one guy who had just moved there from Ohio, didn't understand really hurricane or storm surge impacts or anything like that. And this was about 4 days after the storm had left. This was the first day we were actually able to get that far out toward the beach. And he looked like Tom Hanks from Castaway. Like he I don't know if he grew the beard in 4 days or what. He looked like he had been out in the sun the whole time. Their sewage plant had flooded. So they were unable to flush their toilets. He didn't have any clean running water. And he said he had only kept food for like 1 or 2 days. So he was, now that the road was reopened, he was leaving as soon as he could. But that's the point of that is his house didn't flood, but he couldn't use his toilet. I mean, if you get put under an evacuation order, do you want to end up somewhere where you're not able to use your toilet? So really want to encourage you, even if your house isn't going to flood, those evacuation orders are put there for a reason. So please heed them. And then also one more point is we will often forecast storm surge over that larger area without getting too specific on purpose. And a great example of that is, this is example from Hurricane Laura, which made landfall in far western Louisiana. But the point of this graphic is that they went back and recalculated if Hurricane Laura was just 20 miles further west from where it made landfall, what kind of difference that would have made. Same strength, same size of the storm and all that. And for some of these stretches of the Louisiana coastline, it's a difference of, I think it was, 10 to 15 feet. So for this stretch of coastline right here, 10 to 15 feet difference of surge. So as much as I wish we were really great at forecasting it, down to 10 or 20 miles, we're not really good enough to do that several days in advance. So they do have to put those evacuation orders in place for a little bit larger area than is actually going to get those major impacts, because these little wiggles in the track of the storm can make 10 to 15 feet of difference in surge. And that, I mean, for a stronger storm, that number could be any higher. But as much as we want to be really specific, these little wiggles can make a huge difference for storm surge. We also do, even storms that stay off the coast, we see rip currents, dangerous surf conditions, all that. We try to message that, put the word out over social media. We try to work with our partners. Hopefully you'll hear it on the news if a storm's staying, like for Alex, it was staying off our coast. No direct impacts, but we did have an increased rip current risk. So hopefully you would be hearing that messaging from several different directions, including if you follow us on Facebook, we're putting the message out on social media. So the storm doesn't have to directly hit us to bring us, potential risks. And then finally now, so this is very intentional, the order we've done this in. We can talk about wind now, but I really wanted to stress it was the water is the first thing to focus on. Now we can look at wind. So strong winds, obviously they can bring down trees, they can cause property damage, power outages. So that's the kind of stuff you need to be prepared for if you're going to stay during a hurricane. And every storm is different. So the size of the wind field is not reflected in that category that we talked about. That's just the maximum wind for any one point within the storm. So some storms have a huge wind field, some are much smaller. Anyone remember Hurricane Arthur from 2014? Yeah, it was a storm, and it was a storm that brought some impacts, but it wasn't one of those that you would like come to the front of your mind of this was a devastating storm. It made landfall just one county over from here as a category 2, but it had an extremely small wind field, mostly focused on the east side of it, that really just brought strong winds to the Outer Banks, where they can generally handle these strong winds. Brought some surge as well, but then we can flip the script and go Hurricane Irene in 2011. That caused much more widespread wind damage, caused a lot of power outages in eastern North Carolina. That was a category 1. I'll say it again in quotes, just a category 1. But the wind field was larger. It made landfall at a little bit different angle. So again, there's so many aspects to it. Please don't focus just on the category. And then, of course, we also can't have tornadoes. We usually have an increased tornado risk when we get these storms. The preferred side of the storm is the east side of the direction of motion, the right side of the storm. But we can get tornadoes in a lot of different areas relative to the storm. You might remember before Hurricane Dorian in 2019, this tornado came ashore for Emerald Isle. You can kind of see, we actually saw it coming on one of the surf cameras. I believe when we saw this, we already had the tornado warning out for Emerald Isle. It ended up going through this park of like manufactured vacation homes, through a bunch of them across the street and on top of each other and all that. Extremely fortunate not to have any fatalities. Several people said they did get the warning, which I think helped with that. But additionally, a lot of people had already evacuated ahead of Hurricane Dorian. But this was almost 24 hours before the actual worst of Dorian arrived. So this is something you need to be alert for well before the actual worst part of the storm arrives. And again, we will issue tornado warnings through the storm. We're 24/7, we're always there. We're gonna be issuing tornado warnings. That's something else that's gonna be pushed straight to your phone as long as cell service is still up. We do encourage you to get a NOAA weather radio as well. If cell goes down, those are run off a completely different tower, the weather radio. So it's a great backup to have. But Hurricane Florence obviously was a slow mover. We had a lot of tornadoes. These are only the tornadoes that we were able to verify. We issued a lot more warnings than this, but there was so much damage, it was hard to tell what was from the hurricane and what was from tornadoes. But we verified 44 tornadoes in essentially from eastern Virginia down to northeastern South Carolina. So lots of tornadoes with Hurricane Florence. Again, we're issuing those warnings and pushing them out, so please heed the warnings when you get them. Tropical tornadoes are generally shorter lived and quicker moving, but because they are quick moving, that really means that when you get that warning, you need to get into a central room in your house as quickly as possible, because they can spin up quickly and move through quickly. All right, I put this last for a reason. The hurricane seasonal outlook came out a couple weeks ago. This is above normal. We're looking at 14 to 21 storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes is the projection. This is based on things like sea surface temperature, several other kind of climatological things that we look at. Major hurricanes, maybe 3 to 6 in the entire Atlantic basin. But put this last because it doesn't really matter, right? I think if they said there was going to be 5 hurricanes or 30 hurricanes, I don't care. I care if I'm going to get hit by a hurricane or if a hurricane's coming here. We might only have 5, but if one of those is coming toward eastern North Carolina, I'm going to prepare just like I would if we're going to have 30. So these outlooks are interesting to look at, but I really want to encourage you to prepare the same every year, regardless of what the outlook was. 1992 is a great example. That was a well below average year, well below average. But tell that to the people who live south of Miami who got hit by Category 5 Hurricane Andrew. I mean, it only takes one. Doesn't matter how many there are for the whole season. It only takes one hitting you. So these outlooks are fun to look at, but prepare the same every year, no matter what the outlook is. All right, that's all I got. So I'm going to be quiet now and open up the floor to any questions, discussion. When have we messed up forecasts in the past that you want to let me know about? Everything is fair game. We don't get everything right. We don't nail everything. So I'm more than happy to hear about it. And people who are on the webinar, you should be able to ask questions as well. There should be a button that should look like a question mark where you can click that and type your question in. So I'll keep an eye on that as well.
I'm going to follow up with some extra information, kind of go a little deeper on a couple of items. I was making notes. So one of the things that Carl talked about was food and water for 3 days. The question usually comes up, how much do I need? What I would tell you, like Carl told you, don't plan on just 3 days. Plan on 7 to 10 days. This place becomes an island. When I say this place, eastern North Carolina becomes an island, either from the storm surge coming up the rivers or the rain falling on the backside coming down the rivers. Either way, we catch it one way or the other. You need to have at least 3 gallons a day per person for water. Eat foods, don't look at me like that. Eat foods or buy foods that don't require electricity to heat up. And what I'm talking about is, the simple things. And I'll say this, it's like ravioli in a can. You don't have to heat that up. You can eat it straight out of the can. Beanie weenies, Vienna sausages, things of that nature. Because you're probably going to be without electricity. Here during Florence, we were without electricity for about 4 to 5 days. So that's when my wife learned how important an ice maker was. So, and of course, air conditioning. But, well, when do I buy my food? Now. Don't wait till 12 hours before the storm comes ashore to go to the grocery store to get your food. What I would tell you is buy 2 or 3 cans now, 2 or 3 items now, and every time you go to the grocery store, because like Carl said, it takes one storm. And if you go ahead and stock up now, you don't have to worry about the rush or lack of food at the grocery stores when the time comes. Gasoline. I love the state of North Carolina for this very thing right here. They have a website that you can go to and look and see what gas stations are on a generator. Because there are gas stations that have generators to where they can pump gas. A lot of this was lessons learned back in the 90s and the 80s when we were seeing people going into Raleigh from one of the hurricanes, and it took them what normally takes us 2.5 hours today to go to Raleigh, 13 hours. I believe that was what, Matthew? 13 hours to go from here to Raleigh. Was your car filled up? because once the power went out, you weren't getting any gas. Cash versus credit cards. I would advocate at least $100, if not more, in cash. Because if the electricity's out, guess what's not working? Your card readers, the ATMs, things of that nature. Make certain you got your medications, at least 7 to 10 days worth, if not more. Your pets, for dogs and cats, gerbils, ferrets, whatever, you know, you pretty well know what it takes to feed them each day. You need to make certain that you've got enough food for them as well. Let's see, what was my other one? Shelters. Oh, that big one. Shelters. When do I go? When do I stay? If you're not comfortable staying in your residence, find out when the shelter's open. Go. Don't be afraid to go to a shelter. You may only be there a day, 3 days, a week, 2 weeks, but at least you're dry. You got a warm place to sleep at night. Yeah, it's a little crowded, but hey, it's better than being in a moldy, wet environment and getting sick, no food, no water, no electricity. Find out where your shelters are. Onslow County has shelters all over this county. Dixon, what is it? Dixon, no more? Where's the nearest?
So I'll tag in on that. The new shelter for the Seatsbury Holly Ridge area is going to be Coastal Elementary. And we would do that because the actual building that will be sheltered in is fully generated. So the kitchen and the sleeping areas are fully generated, and it's rated for a capital hurricane. So it's one of our newer shelters. Coastal is on the coast all the way to the very end. If you have pets, you want to go to Jasper Promise Middle School. That's the pet branded shelter.
Yeah. So don't wait till the storm's up on you. Make that decision. If you're gonna stay, stay. If you're gonna go, go. If you're gonna go to the shelter, go. Don't sit around and wait till the last minute. Flooding, Carl touched on that. It's the storm surge versus, like I said, the river surge or the river flooding that comes back down after the storm moves in. And give you a good example with Florence, New Bern. We were in the worst part of the storm as it came in, and it pushed all that water up the Neuse River. And in certain parts of New Bern, how many of you familiar with New Bern? You've been there before. You know where the convention center's at. It was roughly almost 8 to 12 feet of water, underwater. And you go back today and you look at that now and figure water over your head during that storm. So these are the things that you have to be aware of. I'll tell you this, the first thing I did when we bought our house here in Holly Ridge, I went and I looked at the flood maps. What was the highest storm surge? I'm 20 feet above the highest storm surge for that lot. I am 6 feet above the 500-year floodplain. That made me happy. We bought the house. My wife was extremely happy. Gentlemen, I will tell you this. You want to irritate your wife at 2:30 in the morning? FEMA has an app for that. You can download the FEMA app. It has alerts in it. You can tell it what you want to receive. It will send it out to you, make all kind of racket at like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. And she reaches over and smacks you and say, turn that thing off. Code Red. I love Code Red. The city of Holly Ridge has Code Red. Well, how do I get it? How many of you have a cell phone? Notice I just said cell phone, not Apple or Android. Google in your app store Code Red. Download it. Register your telephone number for where you live. And it's pretty much you're done. You can what we call geofence. You can make a circle on the map that you get with that Code Red app, and you want to hear about every alert that happens in that given circle. I think it goes down to at least 5 miles. The nice thing about Code Red, and the reason I like it, is because as I travel west or I go across country, guess what's following me? My Code Red. So I can look and see, am I going into an area that's got a lot of alerts or things of that nature? And then I can set my phone up to receive those incoming alerts in that geofence. So I love Code Red. Onslow County's got it. The city of Holly Ridge has got it. They don't use it just for weather. They also will tell you if there's a boil water advisory or broken water main or something that may affect the health of the community, they will release that as well. So, I like having that one. Of course, it does aggravate my wife again at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. She goes, how many of those things do you have? And I'm like, 4. So the other item, and then I'll probably look at Stacy on this one, evacuation orders. For the city of Holly Ridge municipalities, they will order an evacuation. The county will not tell you, as you live in an incorporated area, you have to evacuate. What the county will do, and I hope Stacy corrects me or shakes her head, says, yep, he's right. But what the county will do is they will order evacuation in unincorporated areas of the county. So Holly Ridge, Surf City, North Topsail, Swansboro, places like that that are incorporated, they will make that decision to let their population know you need to go. All of this is done in coordination with the county. So the city leaders are talking with the county, and the county's talking to the state as all this is going on. And I'm now, how far off was I? So, I'm probably hitting the wave tops right here. Now, I will tell Carl, I'm upset at you right now because you gave away all my secrets. Everybody in my subdivision thinks, oh man, this guy's great. He knows, except for somebody. Now that you've told them where the websites that they can go get all this information, that I can now turn it over to the rest of y'all as I leave. So, but does anybody got any questions? Now, we've got Stacy back here from the county, so if you need more information, do not hesitate to ask her questions. Carl is here for you tonight. If this is, you got something you want to know about the installation to a certain degree, Mike's here. He can tell you how things are done and how things that we do on the installation may impact outside the fence. So if you have any questions, please let us know. I don't know if anybody that has any questions online or not.
Code Red.
Code Red.
It doesn't work on iPhones. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, no.
No?
Oh. Code Red. That's my phone. If you've got a cell phone, iPhone platform or Android platform, and you can go into the App Store and type in Code Red and just follow the prompts, and it will geolocate you as to where you would receive your alerts from. It's cold.
I'm freezing. It's not a road.
Most of the time when I work things, yes, that safe way to use the bathroom or later. But my question is, when you got a public control, what different you get locked? Over here is how to call that chip room. That's different, small, And I don't know if you over here safe to be close and bathroom. The kind of producing over there is long, strong, that ways to happen.
Same thing here. If the wind is the issue, and I'll use the tornado
scenario. Go to your bathroom, go to a closet, get to the center of your structure of your house. Wear a helmet, get you a bike helmet. I know that sounds crazy, but that's a lot of times if there is a structural collapse, we see a lot of head injuries. So to minimize those head injuries, get you a good bike helmet and grab if you can, grab pillows or a mattress you can cover over with. Especially if you got small children, you can put them in the bathtub, cover it over with a mattress, and hope for the best. And I'll say it, hope for the best, because you never know what's going to happen with a tornado. Like Carl said, it only takes one storm to ruin your life and to mess your day up. You had a question?
Yes, so in my house, I have one room. The entire house does not have a window. Every single room is like glass wall.
Closet? You got a closet in your hallway. I know how your house is laid out. Most of the time they will say a bathroom because of the studs in the wall and the piping. Now, the only thing I can tell you is go where you feel the safest. And I really just, that's all I can tell you. And she punches you in the heart.
It's warming me up.
Oh, okay. Anybody got any questions? If not, I appreciate y'all coming out this evening. I do apologize for it being so cold, but I can't change anything. They're under lock, or they're programmed a certain way. But we're done, so you can run outside and get warm again.
Very quickly.
Thank you, Colin, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I checked in my email address, so really please do reach out. And take we got brochures, we got lots of magnets. I'll get in trouble if I take any of those magnets back to the office with me, so please grab a handful, take as many as you want.